Hello and welcome. We're here with Cristina, who is a member of the CES committee, and today's episode is just about understanding what cultural evolution is and about understanding what CES does, what the Cultural Evolution Society does. My name is Farah Badiani. I'm the student for the committee, and Cristina is an executive member. So, Cristina, what do you want to introduce yourself? What is it that you do? What is your research? Stuff like that, just generally.
Thanks so much for organizing this, Farrell. I'm Cristina Moya. I'm a professor of anthropology. So that's the field I'm coming to within the CES organization. And I take an evolutionary approach to understanding human behavior and culture. And some of the main topics that I work on are intergroup relations, particularly in the context of interethnic and interlinguistic group boundaries, trying to understand how those develop and how they're different from non-human group boundaries. Right now, I'm working on a project in Peru on the adoption of new religious pilgrimage behavior. So trying to understand the origins of collective religious behavior rather than just how it's maintained. And I'm also interested in reproductive decision making and how culture influences that. I think that humans are very cultural species, and so it's pretty amazing that even something as close to our kind of fitness and reproductive success is under the influence of cultural institutions, preferences. So it's another area of research of mine. And for the CES, I have a mixed bag of tasks. I guess it's mostly communication and outreach efforts and making sure that the material that's out there for our members, but also others to access, represents accurately what Cultural Evolution members do.
So that sounds really interesting. But let's dumb it down for people who may not be from like cultural evolution and stuff like that, because I know you use words like fitness, even culture.
Yeah.
It's a very ambiguous word. It's like a fuzzy category in terms of there's no real definition. So maybe can you take us through what you maybe mean by culture, what you maybe mean by evolution, and then maybe what cultural evolution means?
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I should be more cautious. I have to be for teaching undergraduates as well. Because every subfield, every field has its own kind of definition of culture. And it's kind of one of those things that people think they know when they see it. I think for most people who think of themselves as cultural evolutionists, they would agree that it's information that's socially learned, at least minimally, right? And then primarily that's like stored in people's minds or brains, or non-humans as well. So that's another thing that maybe a lot of people might not be familiar with, is that a lot of people in our society, a lot of biologists would accept that non-humans also have culture, or at least there's wide consensus that non-humans engage in social learning, right? There's transmission of information from one individual's brain to the other, and that affects their behavior. So that's a very minimal definition of what culture is. We can then kind of debate whether it has to be broadly shared by a group of people, how broadly it would have to be shared, whether each individual can have their own culture. Those are kind of places where, depending on the project or people's theoretical positions, like it might break down a little bit more or be more variable. And then with evolution, that's another term that people tend to conflate with natural selection a lot of the time, the process whereby adaptation is produced. And that's true even when thinking about biological evolution. A lot of people think, oh, natural selection, that's evolution. That's what Darwin figured out, and maybe Wallace. In the broadest sense, for both biological and cultural evolution just means change, right? And so there are other mechanisms that produce cultural change that don't necessarily produce adaptation, don't produce like a feature that is a good fit for the environment, right? Or that improves its ability of the individual that holds it to reproduce, right? So there are a lot of other mechanisms of biological change or genetic change. And then with cultural evolution, there are even more mechanisms of change. And so cultural evolution is the study of that culture change, how ideas that people transmit to each other change through time, the mechanisms whereby that happens. And some people might hear some of this and think, like, why isn't this just history? And I think it's maybe important, I don't know, do you think this might be interesting to differentiate, like, why cultural evolution goes a little bit beyond history. So a lot of historians would not consider themselves cultural evolutionists, but I think this is also just partly kind of a disciplinary difference. So like the cultural evolution tends to be really interdisciplinary. So it includes biologists, yes, some historians, but anthropologists, psychologists, and other social scientists, and also humanities scholars who are interested in this like related questions. It has, I think, because of this linkage to biological evolution, it sometimes uses some frameworks that were developed for biological evolution or mathematical models from that field, although they're obviously like not necessarily constrained by those, but it's definitely been influential in the field. And so this toolkit of like, understanding the mechanisms and building mathematical models of how things change is not very popular in history, let's say. And another important difference is that historians often are constrained by looking at populations where there's text, right? Where they've written things down, and cultural evolutionists aren't. So this would leave, if we only look at societies with a written record or a rich written record, we're going to miss out most of human evolutionary history. We're going to miss out a lot of populations that, didn't have written records, and a lot of individuals, even within literate populations, that didn't have like lots of written records about them. And not to mention, of course, other species that we kind of agree have culture. So I think that's why, even though the broadest cultural change definition sounds like history, I think it can be even broader than that.
Yeah, I agree. Like from what I know, because I would like to believe that I'm a little bit well versed with the field.
Yeah.
From what I would differentiate between the two is, I think essentially the focus of the subject. Like the focus of the subject in cultural evolution is to understand how we better survive through these cultural changes that have happened through society. Whereas for me, history is a lot more about just describing these cultural changes rather than talking about how we have adapted or how we have responded these historical and cultural changes that have happened. Maybe we can ground this argument possibly by giving an example. Maybe if you could give an example that differentiates between like what you would consider to be history versus what you would consider to be cultural evolution.
Okay. I would say that there is a very heavy dose of adaptationism within cultural evolutionists, but not necessarily all cultural evolutionists would be adaptationists.
Got it. Yeah, that's interesting.
But I agree. Like I agree that there's like a heavy emphasis on adaptation. And I think another thing that your comment brought up is explanation, maybe trying to give a deeper explanation than just a more descriptive enterprise. That might be true. I don't know if all historians would agree. Let's see. An example of history versus cultural evolution that tackles like a similar question, maybe?
Maybe I should give you, because my subject is in religion.
Religion.
And I know you're studying religion.
Yeah.
Maybe you could ground it in religion as an example of how historians maybe study it and how we study it.
I mean, I think maybe I didn't bring this up earlier, but I think most kind of research on the history of religion would probably take a particular religious tradition, let's say Christianity, and read a lot of texts written by the founders or people who developed the theology of Christianity, and see kind of how maybe that changed and describe how that changed. And they might relate it to kind of institutional changes as well, kind of pressures from society. There's a famous historian Rodney Stark, who has pseudo-adaptationist perspectives, I would say, of the origins and spread of Christianity, how in the Middle Ages of Europe, Christianity took it upon, or there were interests of the Christian church to limit the power of competing secular powers like nobility, for example. So, I wouldn't say that they don't have an explanatory framework, but it's a slightly different one. And it's very grounded in like specific historical trajectories and time and place, right? And so they tend to be richer and more, I would say in some ways, like more cautious. And I think that like cultural evolutionists who study religion are much more willing to make cross-cultural comparisons, for example, much more willing to have like a framework that says, okay, what does Christianity and the spread of Islam and the spread of Judaism and the spread of Hinduism have in common, if anything, to be fair? Like maybe it doesn't, right? Do the beliefs in these different religious traditions develop some similarities, even though they're starting kind of, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are not independent of each other. And I don't even think Hinduism is, but you might know better than I do. But like, despite being kind of practiced in different parts of the world by different people at different places and times, like maybe there are certain kinds of systematic changes that happen. Some of the ones that have been proposed are, for example, beliefs in moralizing deities that maybe help societies that are more anonymous and large scale foment cooperation, right? So that's a big hypothesis out there developed by Aronor and Zion and supported by others, cultural evolution. So I think the cross-cultural and the kind of big picture historical perspective is something that people in cultural evolution feel a bit more comfortable with compared to kind of more traditional historians, and trying to understand like why, and maybe like trying to understand why those similarities might appear.
Yeah, I think your description is very spot on. The way I have grounded it in my head is, I think, and I could be wrong, and not all historians do this, but I guess historians report on the theological correctness of the religion, whereas what is written in the text, what is prescribed in the text, but as, cultural evolutionists, we focus on like maybe some theological incorrectnesses that may be there, which is not practicing the religion the way it's prescribed, maybe the way they change because they help you function better in society, or they improve your fitness per se. So I think theological incorrectness would be of great interest to cultural evolutionary academics, versus historians would probably put more emphasis on the theologically correct versions of practicing that religion, but not always. Obviously, these are broad stroke statements that may not apply to each and every one in the field, but I think that's really, really cool.
To add to that, I think it might be part, again, like a methodological constraint. So if you look at historians who are looking at more recent times, all of a sudden you could see like individual people's behavior, like more people are writing stuff, they have a richer like written record, more people are disagreeing with each other. It's very clear that people are not behaving in a theologically correct way. So I think as you get to more recent records, like all of a sudden historians do more of that type of work, where it's not just about like the theology. But I think if you go deep back in time enough, what you're going to be left with are just the writings of a very few, literate people. So I agree, like I can't speak to all historians of like, let's say early Christianity. I mean, maybe there are some like, surely there are like some early adopters of Christianity in the Roman Empire that left some written records that might be really interesting to ask that question. But it's just going to be less of the material that they have to work with.
Yeah. I would say that is the beauty of cultural evolution as a field, is that it's not limited to a particular discipline. It's actually anyone from any discipline can kind of take on this perspective within their field and take it forward. Like I practice it from a psychological point of view, you practice it from an anthropological point of view. And I believe that you can practice it from like a, from coming from like from the background of being a historian as well, if you just take on a specific perspective of seeing how cultural change affects human behavior. Having said that, I want to explore this a little bit more in that you said non-humans also have a culture. Can you maybe explain for like people who don't obviously live or practice culture? Because as humans, I feel like we understand when we say culture, it's like you said, it's a thing when you see it, you recognize it, because we practice it on a day-to-day basis. How have you recognized culture within non-humans or animals?
Yeah, I definitely haven't studied it, but so many of our colleagues do this work, right? And I think what is uncontroversial is that so many species like fish, bees, non-human primates, they use information that they see others using and copy it, right? And there has been like, for a while, there'd been a big debate about if you saw, for example, two different groups of chimpanzee, like clasping their hands together in a different way, or using a nutcracker, or not cracking their nut with an anvil and stone. Was that a cultural difference? Was that something that they learned from each other? And in the wild, it's really hard to tell. But more and more, there are studies in the lab with pretty much all of these species, and also studies that take the lab to the field, to kind of a more natural environment where these species might be living, and really isolate the fact that, no, they are using the information that another member of their species is producing observing it and copying it, right? So it's not, you don't need to have language, for example, at least not anything like human language, to be able to copy what others are doing. And, a big question for a lot of our colleagues is, how does the fact that, even non-social lizards, that's one of the things that really gets me, non-social lizards that don't live in large groups of others, if you give them the opportunity to learn from others, they will. So how do you go from, all right, it's a particular species.
Like, for example, what is it that they copy if no?
Honestly, I forget. I don't remember this. Like, I read it so long time ago, and I just internalized that this was very demoralizing for an adaptationist like me. So I can look it up and I can get back to you, but
no, oh good, yeah, but that's very cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It suggests that like it's not that hard, right? It's not cognitively that hard to use that information if you have it available. It might be something like food choice. Like food choice paradigms have been very popular in the lab, where you give like animals like a pink food and a blue food to eat. The model, like one demonstrator picks the blue food, and then the other individual can see that and can choose between the two foods, something like that. I know that it's been used with primates. I'm not sure if it's what they use with lizards. So we engage in social learning, as do a lot of other species. But I think that, part of the reluctance to see culture in other species is because it looks so different, right? Like you do not see ziggurats, you do not see temples, you do not see monumental architecture, we do not know, but we probably don't see complex religious beliefs and rituals in other species. And so, a big question for our field is what's different about culture in other animals, and culture in humans, right? What is it that allows for, some people think like one of the things to be explained is like what allows for the intergenerational ratcheting up of kind of cultural technology or cultural knowledge in humans that we don't see as much in other species. But yeah, some of the things that it looks like is like tool use that's copied from other individuals, food choices that rats learn from other members of the same species, bees learning where to forage from members of the same species. It's really quite a wide-ranging set of things that other species learn from each other, but it doesn't ever seem to amount to something quite as complex as human culture.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I, in my limited knowledge of animal culture, read that they engage in what we also engage in, is over imitation. They'll pick up on things. They'll pick up on like every process has its steps, and they'll pick up on all the steps that could be unnecessary to reaching the end goal, like we do as well. So I would say ritual behaviors is a form of like over imitation. You actually need to go through any of that to reach the end goal, but we still do it because you'd rather copy and be safe than not copy and perish. So I think that's really.
What were the other species that do it? Because I remember like one
I'm
of the
not sure, but I know
findings.
chimps did it.
Oh, really? Okay, so that must be like they've overturned that belief then, because I think like the classic result was that chimps didn't over imitate and humans did.
Oh, interesting.
I think it was like, was it Whiten and Horner? But maybe they've done like more clever studies since then, like with the artificial fruit
My knowledge
test.
is outdated.
No. Or I haven't looked at that for a long time.
Yeah. I think so. I think it was like stick usage to like hunt out food from somewhere.
From the artificial fruit?
Okay. Yeah, and then I think they copied the whole process.
Okay, so I think they do if it's an opaque fruit box, but if you make it transparent and then they can see that all those steps are not necessary, then they don't. Does that ring a bell? Is that right? Okay.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think that's something similar. And yeah, I think that's really, really interesting in terms of how it plays a role in terms of functionality. I think the more interesting question I want to ask you is, why do you think it's important to study things from a cultural evolutionary point of view, both for human and non-human societies? What do you think it is contributing to our understanding of the world that other fields aren't?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think if we take a very minimal definition of cultural evolution, then it's very obvious that like there's not a single policy that we might care about where we don't need to understand how culture changes, whether it's individuals changing their minds, whether it's institutions changing. Institutions are obviously collections of individuals. So how does kind of collective individual decision-making work? If it's a cohort replacement, which one of my postdocs, Nico Ochoa, has done a lot of work showing that sadly, people don't change their minds very much, but they do die. And so that changes populations. So, it doesn't matter what fields you come from, or what your policy goals are. Like if you want to affect something with climate change, if you want to change people's political opinions, if you want to strive for kind of intergroup peace, like that requires people changing somehow, or populations changing. Now, a lot of social sciences do that, right? So I think that's like a really deep question of like, what does our framework bring to the table? And I would say like a couple things. One of them is that it's kind of like a synthetic framework that you can you can speak across different disciplines in a way that then you can bring the best of all the disciplines together and speak with each other rather than past each other to try to affect those changes. So even some of the words that I just used, right, like talking about individual change versus institutional change versus cohort replacement. So you need to know a little bit about psychology, a little bit about demography, a little bit about, sociology. Across cultural perspective, I think is very common in our field, like not being so myopic to think that, everything that we know of how the U.S. undergraduate population works today or how U.S. institutions work today is how it's always been across space and time, or how it always has to be in the future. And I think it's something that a lot of cultural evolutionists are very proud about is also that they bring modeling to the table. So that they have formal models of how things might be working that force you to really operationalize how you think things change and then put them to the test with empirical data. So I think those three things, the interdisciplinarity that is brought about by a common framework, a common language, everybody knowing a little bit about other fields, the cross-cultural perspective, and the modeling kind of approach would be two big things that cultural evolutionists pride themselves on. And I think you've been kind of hinting at this, Farrell. Maybe you would want to add this, like kind of the grounding in biology, I think makes some perspectives a little bit more plausible than others. So thinking that like people have their own motivations that evolved over deeper evolutionary time, right? Or cognitive mechanisms that evolved over deeper evolutionary time. Like it's really hard to get people to want to commit suicide, right? Or any organism to want to commit suicide. This is a bit of a silly one. But because like over generations of time, like that probably wasn't a very good way to, like the people who would have committed suicide because of their unhappiness wouldn't be represented today. Now, it doesn't mean that suicide isn't like a huge social problem today, right? But you still bring to the table that perspective that like something interesting must be going wrong because obviously like genetic evolutionary history wouldn't have really figured that motivation, right? So I think that grounding in kind of broader evolutionary theory like also frames some of the debate.
Yeah, I particularly find it really interesting. I'm actually delivering a lecture on this today in teaching a lecture about mythology, the role of mythology, specifically mythologies. And to the class, I'm bringing the paradigm of like proximate and ultimate causes of behavior, which is that everything that we see, every cultural artifact, everything that we see around us that still exists and is still predominant somehow still serves a certain function that helps us continue surviving as a species. Like it has this deeper ultimate role that helps us evolve and continue. Whereas like proximate cause of something may be, I don't know, like why do you love your children? And the proximate answer could be like, oh, biology and oxytocin and stuff like that. But ultimately it's because if you love your children, you're going to put more resources towards them and then they're going to survive and then your genes are going to survive. And so, I mean, that's the perspective that I like, in that it makes a lot of sense to me. It explains many things to me. I think taking the example of suicide, it makes sense that in India, suicide was illegal for the longest time. It was literally a crime to commit suicide. And it's no longer, it's overturned now, and obviously because of a lot of like activism and stuff like that. But it's interesting that even though it's an individual choice, it's associated to so much communal shame because it's just so contrary to, you know, societal functioning and individual functioning that there are like, it's not just, oh, like committing suicide is just like, it's counterintuitive. Obviously it is, but there are also now systems and societal systems in place to kind of prevent that from happening. And, you know, we've been working towards destigmatizing it and all of that. But I think shame had its own role, and, you know, shame towards people committing suicide had its own role in trying to curb that behavior, which may no longer be serving a purpose or the same purpose today. So that is my take on cultural evolution. But that was a really interesting thing that you mentioned a while back, and I kind of want to bring that in now, is that you said all cultural evolutionary dynamics take an adaptation perspective or not, you know? What does that mean? Like, what do you mean by that? If you could just elaborate on.
Yeah. So let's start with biology first. There are even some biologists also who are not very adaptationists, right? And part of that is recognizing that genetic change happens also just for other reasons. And in biology, that's usually because of random chance that some people or some individuals like happen to reproduce more than others or happen to die because of mutation and because of migration. Like those three other forces affect kind of the distribution of traits in a population, but they don't necessarily help the functioning. Like it doesn't necessarily promote like the genetic complexes or the traits that are best suited to the environment or that make you reproduce more are the ones that are going to be favored. So a lot of biologists actually focus on those. They're called neutral evolutionary mechanisms, right? And there's a lot of cultural evolutionists who also feel that way, that a lot of culture change is kind of independent of how useful they are for a particular environment. I think with cultural adaptations is also a little bit like harder to define like what it means to be adaptive, right? Because is it that it helps you individually have lots of babies? Or is it that it's a cultural adaptation because it helps itself reproduce? Or that it helps the group reproduce, right? If enough people in the group have this idea that, you know, you should help your brother out, your neighbor out, that idea can reproduce itself at the cultural group level, which is much less common at the genetic change. So I think defining cultural adaptation is a bit harder. There are more mechanisms or more ways that we might think of adaptation in culture. And at the same time, there are more ways that we can also imagine cultural traits just spreading because of non-adaptive reasons. And one of the things that allows that to happen is that, at least in humans, but in a lot of other species too, it seems that we don't always learn from our parents, right? So, you know, my students can copy, I don't think they ever would, but they might copy some behavior that I have, even though they're not related to me. And the behavior that I have might be very maladaptive, like not having children, right? And so all of a sudden, like the behavior of not having children can spread because maybe somebody's in a position where they're broadcasting their voice, or some people find them prestigious or high status, and that spreads even though help them survive in any particular world. Or it definitely doesn't help their reproductive success, right? Or like their genetic fitness. I think there are other cases where, for example, some people argue that very catchy songs like fit kind of cognitive predispositions that we have, and they might be very likely to spread, but they're not really helping you kind of fit to your environment in any meaningful way. So some cultural evolutionists would focus on those other mechanisms of change, or think that they're more important even than kind of more adaptive mechanisms of change.
That's really interesting. I've never actually had that perspective. And I think that's a really interesting perspective. I also quickly want to highlight maybe some disciplinary debates that exist in the field. I know that some people believe that a lot of our behavior is a product of biological, genetic inheritance, and culture plays a minimal-ish role in maybe just how these genes are expressed, versus there are some blank slate approaches to the same theory that we are born without any genetic predispositions, and everything that we've learned is cultural. Maybe could you just elaborate on maybe some of the debates that that exist within society? You can maybe define your positionality, but that's maybe not, if you don't feel like doing that, you don't have to.
Unfortunately, like I think most reasonable people would agree that it's both. And kind of the question here is, what are, let's say, the cognitive mechanisms that genetically evolved that then give rise to the ability for culture, that give rise to the range of behaviors that we see? Within cultural evolution, I think there's actually a really big tent here. I think, as you said, like there are some people who are very much hesitant to even talk about a human nature because they think that it's so culturally specific. And that the only thing that we can say is that human nature is to be a cultural species, right? So that's kind of like the minimal position, the most blank slate position. And then like on the other ends, I think there are much more, biologically grounded people who say like we have, important genetically evolved motivations that help make sense of like why we have the incest taboos cross-culturally, right? Or why we have cross-culturally marriage systems, or I think they would often recognize that there's cultural variation, but probably think that it's some sort of interaction between the environments that people find themselves in and the human nature that they have, right? So nobody is really talking about genetic variation in humans as being an important explanation for this variation, right? But that we all share a certain genetic nature that might influence the form that culture takes, like why religions tend to believe in big gods, or patriarchy seems to be cross-culturally common, or think like really big picture questions sometimes. I guess I have been moving a little bit more from the position of there's a lot of genetically evolved cognitive architecture to kind of a recognition that it's really hard to tell, first of all, if that's true, or like the form that takes. I think there is a very rich genetically evolved cognitive architecture that has to underlie everything that we do. But it's also true that cultural evolution itself can produce adaptive designs that then we learn about and make us act in very adaptive ways. So one example that my colleagues like to bring up is how good we are at reading, right? Like if you looked at reading capacities in the brain of humans, it would look like a very well-designed cognitive capacity for reading, but we know that we didn't evolve to read, but we evolved a brain that's capable of becoming very good to read. And we evolved culturally writing systems that make it pretty easy for us to read, right? So I think most people who are doing like good work in our field are just trying to figure out, for one question, like reading, what does that cognition look like, right? What does the evolution of writing systems look like? And how do those work together?
It's really interesting.
So I think there's definitely the spectrum, but I think probably nobody is, and at least like that's another nice thing about our field, I think, is that there are very few like extreme blank slatists or like extreme genetic determinists, right?
That is really interesting. And it makes me feel much better to know that my brain has not evolved to read well.
Are you dyslexic? I mean, like maybe it even makes
no.
No, okay.
I'm not dyslexic. I just don't like reading. I just don't like reading. I'm like, every time I meet people, they're like, I have read so many books in a year. And I'm like, I cannot. I read the research papers that I need to, and I don't read anything beyond it because it's so that's good to know. That's good to know that my brain is a bit pre-evolved.
There you go.
But, there's an explanation for everything. So that's really interesting. So maybe you want to take us a little bit through your work and what your work is like and how cultural evolution fits into the work that you do.
Okay, yeah. So it depends on the research questions. Some of the research questions I work on are more about, let's say, do we have any genetically evolved predispositions to think about human groups in specific ways? So, for example, I've done some work suggesting that maybe children do think of language boundaries as really important ways of organizing the social world. And if that's true, then that's something that's kind of specific to humans, because other species, or at least other primate species, I should say, don't use language as like an ethnic marker, right? Maybe we can talk about whales some other day, because whales do have like, interesting like what whale researchers call dialects that do seem to carry social meaning. So in that type of research is more about some genetically evolved capacities potentially. And right now, on the other hand, I'm working on something that, it might incorporate genetically evolved tendencies for thinking in ritual ways or from learning from others. But we're really trying to figure out like why some people, well, how do you get a pilgrimage site off the ground, right? So pilgrimage evolves culturally in a lot of different societies. And it's kind of like a puzzling ritual by definition, because people are going out of their way to go on an arduous trek to go to a sacred site that maybe provides them some supernatural benefits, right? And we understand pilgrimage can sustain itself. We understand a lot of the mechanisms whereby pilgrimage can sustain itself if like you get rewards from your community members for going on pilgrimage, or you get punished if you don't go on the pilgrimage. So once it gets going and everybody agrees that it's kind of a good thing to do, then it kind of we understand how it's sustained. But we had this opportunity in the Peruvian highlands to look at a new ritual site, a new pilgrimage site that appeared now it's been like 10 years ago, but we've been kind of tracking it to see who decides that, okay, yeah, I'll take the risk and I'll go to this new site that actually some of my neighbors say is the work of the devil, but some of my neighbors say is like Jesus Christ's face on the side of a mountain and that it's very powerful. And it's kept this in a very syncretic form. So Antioch Catholicism also has like traditional figures like the toad and the white horse of St. James and the chicken that have also appeared as rock configurations in the site, and that also kind of lend credibility to its being magical and having supernatural powers. But it also makes some people suspicious that it might be no good or that it might be like a bit dangerous. So, one thing that I think cultural evolutionists have a hard time with is kind of linking the microevolution or the small scale cultural change to the macroevolution, like the big scale, kind of historical scale cultural change. And while this project is very much a microevolution project, because we're looking at the last 10 years at most, right? We have one more year next year that we can collect data. So 12 years of data, I think we'll have. That's still very small in the human time scale, right? But it hopefully helps make sense a little bit of how is it that these kind of ritual sites can crop up and get going? Like, what does it take? What do we have to assume about human cognition, about the benefits that they provide to society, about how people learn from each other to make something like this work? And something that would be awesome to study, but I think it's really hard, is all of the failures as well, right? Like we only see cultural traits that persist, or we disproportionately see cultural traits and cultural lineages that persist. But the cultural traits that don't do well and don't go anywhere are really hard to measure. And so maybe this will be a successful site, maybe it won't. In some ways, it would be very interesting if it didn't persist, and we could see maybe also like what goes wrong, right? So that's kind of what I'm up to now.
That's actually really, really cool. And because I study religion, I always thought that religious pilgrimage is a product of trends. So credibility enhancing displays. But for people who don't know, it's basically you put your mouth where your
money where your mouth is?
Your money where your mouth is. Oh my God, I tried to say it at a conference and I was like, you put your money where your food is, your mouth where your food is.
Your foot in your mouth.
Your foot in your That's basically what I did. Yeah. It's basically you put your money where your mouth is. You engage in these like really costly displays, that are like costly in terms of like energy, money, costly in any way, but to show your dedication to that group, to that behavior, to that belief, and that it kind of shows that you are a dedicated member of the group, and then also passes the belief down because, people believe that there's a reason why people are behaving or investing so much is what I understood pilgrimages as. So do you have any other theories that maybe would even explain why a new pilgrimage would?
Yeah, so I think that we do talk about this in a paper we're writing now. We do think that creds may play a role and costly signaling may play a role, but they're much more plausible as explanations for how it's maintained or maybe once it has like enough people going, how it spreads. But at the very beginning, if you're the first person who like goes far away, first of all, far away from your community, so it's kind of hard for them to see you, but goes far away and like does some arduous task going up a mountain and spends a bunch of money getting there and giving offerings to a religious figure, you might be showing that you're dedicated to something, but it's not that you're dedicated to what other people think, right? And you might be showing that you really believe that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that what you believe is true, right? And so you might just as likely be seen as a loony person, right? And so I think at the beginning, this is why I find it so interesting. Like, I think that at the beginning, there's really a bigger challenge in terms of explaining it. And something that my postdoc, Nico Restrepo and I have been playing with is the role of uncertainty in kind of everyday payoffs that people experience, which is obviously like a very classic, theory of relevant to classic theories of religiosity and spirituality, right? The idea being something, generally it's like people who are more uncertain are more religious, but we actually built a model that kind of helps make sense of how uncertainty might make it easier for people to causally attribute a miracle granting role to a religious site. And then, I mean, it's still a lot of the time it fails, right? Because uncertainty can also make you think like, no, that's not working. But sometimes enough people get the signal that this seems to be working for other people. Enough people socially learn that they get over this threshold. Then if we're playing also a coordination game, makes it more in your interest to start going now as well. So we mapped together coordination game, basically, a stag hunt game is the one way that it's called, with kind of a decision-making and learning under uncertainty model to show how these two forces can sometimes, but not always, like help promote the origin of a new ritual such as pilgrimage. But then all these other things probably play a role too at some point, right?
Really cool. And so, do you know what the initial motivation is to break away from an existing practice
Right.
for something new? Like, for me, as an adaptationist perspective, or having that perspective, I would argue that it's probably the current religious system or the current practices are not meeting some cultural or societal needs, is my understanding. But what is your take on it?
I totally think that can happen. And I think we see that with like a lot of millenarian religious practices that kind of develop under situations of like colonialism and uncertainty and seeing that the world's changing a lot and not being able to make sense of it. I think there's a lot of like that kind of deep rift that then leads to kind of specific religious beliefs about new supernatural beings or maybe ends of times, like, very deep changes. I will say that in this case that we're studying, it's not nearly that deep of a rift. It's basically within the same religious system, and they're changing which site they're going to. So in this case, like if I were being a cynical adaptationist about this, which I am sometimes, like I do think that there are some possibilities, like the fact that a gold mine, so one of the economic things that we think plays a role in like how uncertain people are is whether they're engaging in traditional like subsistence practices versus gold mining. And there's a new gold mine or newish gold mine. Incidentally, this new pilgrimage is on the road to that gold mine. So miners who probably experience more uncertainty than agriculturalists maybe be particularly motivated to go on such a pilgrimage or engage in such a ritual. And additionally, all of a sudden there's this opportunity that presents itself like very conveniently on the road, right? Which kind of takes away from some of the arduousness of the situation. But, I think this is where maybe I would like having to read a bit more history, at least for myself, because I do think these changes do happen in a lot of different ways, right? And I have to acknowledge that like people do change practices sometimes under coercion, sometimes for very pragmatic reasons that I think a lot of the conversion literature suggests, for example, that people might convert for pragmatic reasons, but then the next generation internalizes it because that's what they were raised with. So I think some of that might be going on with such religious changes. I think we'd also have to have like a more exhaustive idea of like what are needs, like what are the fundamental needs that people have. And I do think that like evolutionary theory helps us with that, with coming up with plausible motivations, right? Like not having to travel too much.
Yeah. Yeah, that's research is so fascinating, and we need to speak about it a
Yeah, we
little bit
should
more.
talk more.
Maybe,
Yeah.
yeah. Having said that, can you maybe explain what CES does, why people should maybe attend the conference, what kind of maybe things that they can expect?
Yeah, so the Cultural Evolution Society is like any other academic organization in some ways, that it's meant to be a place, online forum sometimes, for people with all of these interests to come here and learn about the research. And when we go to conferences, which for the CES is both online and in person, it's been like that for several years to really accommodate a largest range of possible participants. That's going to kind of get you a sense of like the most cutting edge kind of research that maybe hasn't even been published yet, right? And it also helps you see like the questions that people ask, kind of make you see how different disciplines can talk to each other or like improve each other. You get feedback from people if you're presenting, people that you might not usually hear their opinions. So I think that's what kind of conferences are really good for. Now, the CES, the Cultural Evolution Society, I think being a relatively recent society, has established some really amazing resources as well that are meant to be broader than just academic mingling, right? And so there are roundtables at some of these conferences that are meant to be for practitioners or people who have applied goals. But they also have on their websites, even if you don't manage to make it to the conference, there are resources online for helping people explore this vast field, including mini workshops and mini courses that you can take for free that have been developed by some of the best teachers and like leading researchers in various different subdisciplines of cultural evolution. So I really encourage people to have a look at those. What else do they do? So the Cultural Evolution Society also puts out calls occasionally for mini grants. Sometimes those grants are for attending the conference, but sometimes they're for research or for applied working groups or for outreach. So we've been very lucky to get independent philanthropists supporting that goal as well. So the website is quite exhaustive. It has a lot of other reading material, like leads on where you might want to read new books or articles that might help you frame the field for you. So it's really trying to be kind of a platform to make it easy for people in different parts of life to access what cultural evolution offers.
I would agree, not only because I'm the student, because I also won one of the Advancing Cultural Evolution Early Career Scholarships. I know for postdocs, there's the Cultural Transformation Grants there. I think it's a really, really great place for early career researchers to check out. And I think it's a great platform to kind of build off from there. CS, before I was even involved with the community, was my first conference ever. And I can say that it was a really, really like a career changing conference for me. So I recommend everyone goes for it. But on that note, Cristina, thank you so much for chatting with us today. I know you're in Peru, so I'm going to let you go and we'll pick this up sometime.
Yeah, let's talk.
Time.